Minutes past 8, and we have Dr. John in the studio from Creation Ministries International. And it's great to have you back again, Dr. John. Good morning.
Yeah. Good morning, Mick. It's great to be here.
Yes, and now, Dr. John, I've got to ask a question. I saw a website, a UNESCO site, mind you, that was talking about the Valley of the Whales, which we've mentioned here a while back, only sort of briefly. The Valley of the Whales, where there's a whole bunch of sort of whale carcasses all in one big line, certainly higher than sea level up in the deserts. And they said that these fossils represent one of the major stories of evolution, the emergence of the whale as an ocean-going mammal from a previous life as a land-based animal. Now, I thought, hang on a minute, that's the opposite of what I've ever heard. Apparently whales, all the, stuff in the sea became land-based later. Now they're saying it went the other way. What's going on?
Yeah, well, actually, that's what's believed, Mick, because they're, I suppose, because they're mammals and they're not fish. They believe that they must have evolved on land and then taken to the sea because they liked it. In fact, that's the general belief that a land-based animal chasing prey which tried to escape into the water, and the land-based animal dived in after it and eventually got so used to doing that they decided they'd like to live in the water. And of course they had to have a few modifications because most land-based animals have got nostrils and things like that, but when they took to the water, the nostrils had to migrate up the back of their head and become a blowhole.
Oh, look, it might have been a swordfish hit him in the head.
Well, anyway, look, this is what's believed. Now, there is not a slightest scrap of evidence for it because there's never been a fossil found that's a pre-whale that had a blowhole. Everything that's a whale has got a blowhole.
Yes,
but it's interesting that you mentioned that Valley of the Whales because there was a recent article in Creation magazine about the very same thing. And these ones you're talking about, they're out in the Sahara Desert.
Yeah, you can go for a trek out from Cairo, but that's probably why people thought that they went to the ocean afterwards, because it's the most unlikely place to find a whole lot of whales.
It is, and of course there weren't just whales there. They found crocodiles and dugongs and other marine creatures, sharks, rays and things like that.
Well, they were the old ocean-going sharks, obviously, before they migrated to the water. Yeah.
They were ocean-going sharks. But interesting, the crocodiles and dugongs as well.
Wow.
So it makes you wonder, how did these things get out there in the middle of the Sahara Desert?
Yes.
And that is one of the hottest and driest places on earth. Not a lot of water out there. And Egypt is hot. I don't know whether you've been there. I have. And the day I went to Abu Simbel, it was about 46 degrees at 9 o'clock in the morning. And the tourists have to go very, very early. Otherwise, all the tourists would collapse with the heat. It's very, very hot. But look, some of these fossils have been so well preserved that they can identify the stomach contents in them.
Oh wow!
And also, of course, the other interesting thing is that the animals that are virtually exactly equivalent to modern day ones, like crocodiles and dugongs. Dugongs, would you believe? I mean, I thought they were pretty much native to Australia, but they're not. But they haven't changed at all. So it doesn't matter how old they believe they are. There hasn't been any evolution of the crocodiles or dugongs because they're pretty much exactly the same as their modern day counterparts. But anyway, look. You wonder how could they have got out there in the desert, marine fossils as well, and pretty much suggests that maybe it was once underwater.
Yes,
now the Sahara Desert hasn't got a lot of water in it now, but it's pretty obvious that. The only explanation for that is a pretty significant sort of flood.
Yes.
And that's not the only place where whale fossils have been found inland. I mean, there's a place in I think in Chile, and about 5,000 feet up in the Andes Mountains, where they've got the same sort of thing. And along with the whale fossils up there, they've got land animals like camels, the fossil camels and rhinoceroses and things like that.
Yep.
Now, why would you have fossil land animals along with fossil whales? It doesn't really make a lot of sense, does it? And we've got to remember that the evolutionary story goes that animals died and sank to the bottom and then got covered in sediment. Well, what about the rhinoceroses and the camels as well? You see, they obviously did not evolve over time, die, sink to the bottom, get fossilised. It just doesn't happen. And there is so much of this all over the world that it's clearly a global event that did it.
Yeah.
And the obvious global event is Noah's flood.
Yeah.
So I mean, really, you have to be in denial not to admit that.
Yes.
But the world will not admit it. UNESCO wants to concoct all these stories about how whales might have got out there and how they might have evolved on land and all this sort of stuff, for which there is no evidence. It is a concocted story and nothing else.
Yep.
So really the safest thing to do is believe the biblical history, because it's never been disproven.
Yep. Well, it was the oldest. It was the original.
Yeah.
And they keep disproving the newer history that they're making up. So often you see them changing the story, but the biblical history stands true.
It stood the test of time, you might say, Vic.
Absolutely. It is 17 minutes past 8. We're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. And if you have any questions, maybe regarding the Valley of the Whales or any of those sort of things, please send them through to our text line, SMS 0401 949 949. Yep, it's an SMS line. You can't leave a voice message. So 1 minutes past 8. We've got the news and weather coming up at 1:30. But right now, we've got Dr. John in the studio from Creation Ministries International. We've been talking about the Valley of the Whales, which are very whale-looking whales. Well, they're, fossils of whales. And the other marine species that have been found around them. And, of course, there's been a story about, UNESCO saying, that was, before whales sort of became fish species, or rather they're mammals in the water or the ocean, but they sort of came from the land to the ocean, yet they were followed by sharks and all sorts of other things. And I've even seen a story on AAP, Australian Associated Press. They had a headline there, "Nothing fishy about ancient marine fossils on Mount Everest." And they've got a picture there of something that looks identical to current day fish. I wonder if they thought that they somehow flapped their way to the top of Mount Everest, Dr. John. It seems a little fishy to me.
It is a long way to flap. I mean, a salmon can get up a waterfall, but getting up to the top of Mount Everest is a little bit more difficult.
Yes.
And of course, they didn't flap their way up there. That's the whole point, Mick. And the Bible tells us what happened at the end of the flood.
Yep.
It tells us that the mountains were pushed up and the valley sank down and the water ran off into the ocean.
Well, I have noticed that even in the AAP story, of course, they're written by non-Christians, and they sort of talk about, their theory is, obviously, to them, there's only one possible way they could have got there, and that is tectonic plates have pushed these fish all the way to the top of the mountains. Now, we all know that in those, really, unstable conditions where mountains are formed, there's massive earthquakes, and for something to go from under sea level to literally kilometres and kilometres, the highest peaks on Earth, they would have had to go through, over millions of years, millions of earthquakes and some pretty unstable times. How do the fossils stay intact all the way through that? I mean, it just blows my mind.
Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense, Mick. I mean, we would say that was a one-off event, and of course the Bible tells us that Noah's flood was more than just a flood, and something happened to trigger it. Was it a fracturing of the Earth's crust or whatever? We know that the Earth's crust is fractured now, and the Bible doesn't go into great detail about it, but it does say that the mountains were pushed up and the valleys sank down and the water ran off. And that's actually quite consistent with what is believed about how the tectonic plates crashed together and pushed up the mountain ranges, and that's why we find fossils of whales 5,000 feet up in Chile. You know, so it all makes perfectly good sense. But the other question is, when did it all happen? And we believe it all happened during and immediately after Noah's flood.
Yep.
And when you think about it, if we go back to Egypt, the pyramids are made out of sandstone. And that sandstone has shells and marine fossils in it. Mm-hmm. Now, how is it possible that the pyramids could have been, say, built before the flood? They couldn't, because it was the flood that has produced the sandstone and the marine fossils.
I have a theory.
Right?
They had really good divers.
Yeah, they probably did. But yeah, that means that all of the structures, like the pyramids that we see around the earth, they cannot be older than Noah's flood. And Noah's flood occurred about 4,500 years ago, according to the biblical time frame, which means that puts an age limit on the pyramids of about 2,500 years. Yep. So, and the same for all the other structures on Earth, man-made.
You're on 94.9 with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. Send studio from Creation Ministries International, and he's talking to us today about some pretty interesting stuff. We've talked about the Valley of the Whales and fish skeletons up in the mountains, and I find it interesting, Dr. John, that the Bible was written, like, you know, many parts of the Bible thousands of years ago, and we're talking about stuff that people are trying to make stories up for, saying it's millions of years ago. However, the Bible had the answers as to why there were fish skeletons way up in the mountains. But that was even before we had, well, no one had ever been to the top of Mount Everest then. That's only a fairly recent thing. And the Bible sort of had answers for stuff that they'd find out about later. Yet we still try and change the story.
Yes, it really is amazing, Mick, that the secular world, I mean, people think you're crazy if you talk about, the Earth only being 6,000 years old, because they've made up their stories about it being millions and billions of years, but there is absolutely no evidence for that at all. And everything that we find, and as you rightly mentioned, nobody had been to the top of Mount Everest if you go back 100 years. It's only Edmund Hillary got up there first. And now we know that there are marine fossils on top of Mount Everest. Now, how did they get there? And the Bible's explanation is, a very obvious one. The world has to make up a concocted story to try and explain it. But look, I think we need to realise that everything that we see around us, the secular world thinks the world's been going on for millions and billions of years, much like it has. The Bible tells a completely different story. Yeah. It says that the world was created about 6,000 years ago and destroyed about 1,500 years later. So the earth that we now stand on looks completely different from the earth as it was created. The Bible tells us that the first man and the first woman, Adam and Eve, were placed in a garden that we call the Garden of Eden. Where was it? We have no idea. And there is no possible chance of finding where the Garden of Eden was, because all of those things pre-flood were obliterated by the flood. So what we have now is everything that was formed during and after Noah's flood. And what we observe is absolutely consistent with that. Like we've just been talking about. Fossil whales up on mountains and in deserts. Stones that form man-made structures like the pyramids containing marine fossils on top of Mount Everest. It's all consistent with what the Bible says. And the tragedy is that people just don't want to believe it. They keep getting told to trust the science. But, the science is often very, very wrong. And sometimes it's actually fraudulent. Now, there was a very interesting article recently about a Dutch archaeologist named Vermaning. And a lot of what he discovered has now been exposed as fraud. He died in about 1987. But he made some astonishing discoveries in a field in Holland in about 1965, supposedly. Found lots of artefacts, stone axes and stone tools and things that dated back to the time of the mammoth hunters, according to the secular story. And he found so much stuff, he was selling it to museums, and the local council gave him money for, because he was a bit of a hero locally. And he was aided and abetted by another guy who was a former priest. And they had supposedly found all of these stone artefacts. But it turned out that it was all fraudulent. They had found a way of making them themselves and aging them to make them look old, and everybody was completely fooled by that, and they wrote journal articles, and all the archaeologists around the world would cite those journal articles as being evidence of this, that or the other, but it was all a fraud. And there have been multiple examples of that over the years. I mean, the most famous one is what we might call Piltdown Man, which we can talk about when we come back.
Absolutely, and we also have a question, and that question was, is all the Bible literal history? So we'll probably talk a little bit about that when we come back as well, or next week, whatever Dr. John says. You're on 94.9, Boys with Love One Another. We're with Dr. John on 94.9. And he's from Creation Ministries International. They do have a website, creation.com. But we love it when you send your questions through to our SMS line or text line. That's 0401 949 949. And we did get a question come through this morning. And that question, Dr. John, was, is all the Bible literal history?
Well, I suppose the answer to that question, Mick, is when the Bible speaks of history, that history is literally true. I mean, obviously the Bible is not just about history. It talks about the history of the world, it talks about the history of the Jewish people, and it talks about the history of the Lord Jesus Christ. But of course it has lots of other things like prophecy and poetry, hymns in Psalms, and all sorts of other,
parables,
lots of other things. But when it talks about history, that history, we believe, is absolutely, literally true. I mean, if you read a contemporary account of the Battle of Hastings in 1066, what William the Conqueror did, that would be literal history, and you would trust that it was probably true. But with the Bible, when it talks about history, like the history of the flood, the history of the Jewish people, what happened and things like that, then that history is literally true. But of course the Bible is not just history.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course Jesus spoke in parables, often telling a story to explain something. But in those stories, he doesn't sort of go and, these exact dates and those sort of things. The parables are written in a different way.
Well, you can tell from the context what's a story and what is a historical event. When the New Testament talks about Jesus and the disciples got into a boat and went over to the other side of the lake, that's history. They went over to the other side of the lake.
Yes.
But people understood what Jesus was saying when he spoke parables. He gave illustrations, things like the prodigal son and things like that. Well, they were stories, but not literally true. I mean, not stories about literal events. They were stories to illustrate a theological point.
Yes, Yes, absolutely.
But anyway, look, the other thing that I was talking about, of course, was some of the frauds that have been perpetrated in the past.
Yep.
We cannot always trust the science because sometimes the scientists are not trustworthy. And unfortunately, there have been many instances where the supposed findings that scientists have made have not been able to be replicated by other scientists who follow on. And when they look at it, they can see that sometimes a lot of the results have been cherry-picked to suit the belief of the scientist. And there are a lot of instances like that. I mentioned Piltdown Man and another one that we might talk about another time called Nebraska Man, and various things that were deliberate frauds. Now, unfortunately, scientists are prone to the same problems that we all have. We're all sinners, and we all have self-interest at heart. And sometimes a scientist will follow a particular line of thinking because he wants to make a name for himself. And, of course, if he can get his paper published in one of the more prestigious journals, then that means his name is even more up in lights, and his article might get cited by other researchers. So, yeah, there's...
you might get funding for more research.
That's another point, you see, because if you have a good name, then it's very likely that if you put up a proposal for research, then you will get funding. So, yeah, there's all these sorts of things. And when we're on the air again next, Mick, we might talk about some of those things in a bit more detail.
Sounds exciting. Yes, of course, we've seen stuff just in the last few years that Dr. John and I have been speaking on air. We've seen stories come through about other stories in the news, and they, they've pretty much said, "Oh, oops, there was a mistake there," or "Oops, somebody got caught out. That wasn't actually true," or oops, that giant, dinosaur that we drew a picture of was actually a pig tooth, because the dinosaur somehow they had the whole shape out of a tooth. And interesting, but I can't wait to hear more about them, actually.
Yeah. Well, artists can do all sorts of things, as we've talked about before, Mick.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're on 94.9. Well, thank you, Dr. John. Another awesome week. And, we'll be speaking with somebody else from Creation Ministries next week, which will be exciting. I'm loving sort of speaking to different guys with different backgrounds. And
next week you're going to have Dr. Taz Walker, who's a geologist, and he's a very, very interesting and lovely guy.
Can't wait. You're on 94.9. If you've got any questions for next week, please send them through 0401 949 949. It is 5 minutes to 9. And, coming up next, we'll have